All right. So, as I like to say with these things, as long as everything is working the way that it should be working, we are now live. So, hello and welcome to everyone who is watching the Written Melanin channel. Where this day may have found you, I'm so glad that you are here. My name is Chelsea, better known as CM Lockhart, and I'm here with Tatiana OB. And this is the Authortube Writing Conference for 2024. And we are here to talk to you about world building. And I'm excited. I'm nervous, but I'm excited. So this is gonna be great. This is gonna be great. So shout out to everyone who's already in the chat. If you've never seen us before, we are actually going to introduce ourselves. So Tatiana can go first while I collect myself, take a couple of deep breaths, and we're gonna get into this.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tatiana Obi, and I write awesome characters slaying dragons because this is a kid-friendly channel and show. And I usually write diverse heroes and heroines. I like slaying things and fighting things, and usually they're doing it in very interesting worlds. And the stranger the world, the better. So I really do enjoy building worlds for my fantasy books.
Awesome. And if you guys are on the channel, hopefully you have seen me before, but in case you haven't, hi, Chelsea. I go by CM Lockhart on the interwebs. I write books about Black girls who aren't all that nice. Maybe you heard me say that on TikTok, and that is why you're here. Don't know. But I write books, like I said, about Black girls who aren't all that nice. I have We Are the Origin and We Are Dying Gods. And it's about a group of assassins who are working together to save the gods in the realm from destruction. And like Tatiana said, we are here to talk about world building because at the core of fantasy, that is what it is. I was going to word that differently, but words are wording today.
What makes fantasy more fun?
Yeah. That being said, a couple of housekeeping things. I'll fix the chat, and I don't know why it's squished, whatever. Couple housekeeping things. If you have questions for us, please lead with a Q in the comments so that we know it's a question, or there's actually a Q&A in the chat that you can fill out. So we will keep an eye on that, and we will be sure to answer some of your questions later. Good Lord. Y'all would think that I don't do this all the time. But that being said, let's go ahead and just start at the beginning. We're going to start at the beginning and talk about our world building process just from the jump and then kind of go from there. So that being said, Tatiana, since you are, okay, just so y'all know, I love Tatiana and I feel like she's better at this than me. So I'm going to let her go first and then we're just going to build off of that.
It's just an excuse to make me go first, but okay. I'll take it. And I also forgot to mention my books, which was Sister Samurai and also A Forging Rage Duology, which is Bones to the Wind and Dragging Your Bones. So I will primarily talk about those books, especially when giving examples for today. And my world building process, I am a pantser. And as we know, there's pantsers versus plotters, and pantsers, they kind of just fly by the seat of their pants. Mm-hmm. And plotters, they're a little bit more designed. They outline a lot more. So it is kind of odd to say that I'm a pantser, but my world building is very detailed and very lush. And how does it get there when I'm just flying on the seat of my pants? Because we do hear of those stories of authors who spend years and years of world building, like J.R.R. Tolkien, or just George R.R. Martin. Like, they spend years world building, fleshing out this world, and just doing that before they even start writing. And I do not do that. What I typically do is I have an idea of what I know what the story is going to be about. I start with an idea. Either it's a character or kind of themes that I want to explore. And based off of that, I'll do world building enough for those themes. And then I get started from there. Like, I do not let world building kind of keep me from writing. I start writing. And then as I write, I do a lot of drafts, and there's a lot of world building in between those drafts. So my stories are very much a layer cake. Well, there's a lot of research in between, and I'm like, okay, I know what the story is a little bit more. What do I need for the story? What do I need to explore for the story? So I'm actually like working and writing a book right now. And I had this character, he came to me and he was like, I am the 99th heir of this country. And I'm like, sir, that makes no sense, because if you know anything about politics and succession laws, having 99 heirs makes no sense. Yeah. So it was up to me to figure out how that works. So, yeah, like I had to sit down and figure out how that worked before starting because his character was like, "That's what it is," and I'm like, "Why you do that to me?" But that's what it's like to be a pantser and world build. Sometimes they're just like, figure it out.
No, that's real because I've one very much fall into the same realm of I'm kind of making this up as I go along, but there are also like characters that come to me and it's just like they have to be a certain way, and no matter how I'm like, you know what, you don't really fit into the plot this way. Let's tweak you a little bit. They're like, just like no. So when it comes to world building in that way, it's just like when you have, like you said, succession. Because also I'm drafting a new novel slash series at the moment, and so part of the world building is just like, oh, how do politics actually work in this world? And it's just like, okay, if it's not, like you said, succession, if it's not an heir, how does this work? And for me, that when it comes to like my world building process, I'm usually like, we will figure that out later. I just know that there's a person in power and we will figure out how they got there later. you know but after so many drafts, you do get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm actually at a point where I do need to figure this out in order for things to make sense as it goes forward. So my process is a little bit like, okay, I have an idea, and I usually start with like how many, like whatever the religious system is in the world, only because that informs so many aspects of how people navigate their lives, whether they want to accept it or not. Um, and so I'm like, okay, we start there, and then we kind of figure out how do these things play into it, whether or not people lean into it, or they're like, nah, or if it's like a hard, like, oh, everybody believes this, like, and We Are the Origin. Everybody, there's no one who's like, oh, the gods don't exist. There are like tangible evidence that it's like, no, they exist. Now, whether you like them or not, completely arbitrary. That has nothing to do with anything. But for this new series, it's just like, okay, the gods are there, but it's a lot more varied as far as what the people actually believe, and that informs like the rest of the world building about how people navigate and how people interact with each other and how people view certain aspects of like interpersonal relationships and politics and all those things. So like I said, top down for me, and just like, okay, we got the gods, now let's figure everything else out. And sometimes we get there and sometimes we don't. But
I feel like you said something very important in regards to having a core that informs the rest of kind of everything around it. Like that really helps. Because even in my story of Forging of Age, I knew what I wanted to do was to go in and talk about coming of age themes.
mm-hmm.
So I went and said, okay, so I wanted to write a passage, and around adulthood, becoming an adult, becoming a big thing, how does that affect everything around it? So sometimes knowing exactly, having an idea of what you want and making that the core and how that affects everything else will lead you to that domino effect.
Absolutely. And I think that world building, obviously, when you're writing, everything ties into each other. So it also ties into, your character development and your plot as a whole, because those things are going to inform how you build your world. So, like you said, Forging of Age, like you said, they're coming of age. So it's like, how do we get to this point? What is the norm for this? What is the expectation for it? And then I'm assuming building it out from there, and how do the characters react to it? I'm not gonna put words in your mouth, but I know that for me, it's like if I have a certain character and I'm just like, okay, I know for a fact that, my character is going to be a necromancer. It's just like, okay, now the world building aspect of that is how does everyone else view necromancy? How does the magic for the system work? How is this character going to navigate the world and their interpersonal relationships? Like, how is that going to affect it? Because I think one of the biggest things with world building, like one of my favorite things to keep in mind, is that everything that you put into your story needs to affect something. Otherwise, it's kind of there just to be there, if that makes sense. At least that's how
But
I
I love, yeah. I love that you said that though, because I feel like a lot of people don't consider how characters can be used in world building. So, for example, in A Forging of Age, or even the story that I'm writing now, I try to have a character or a side character from each socioeconomic class, or a side character from each different subculture or each different country. So through that character, we can kind of explore what those different aspects of the world looks like. So sometimes having characters, having diverse characters that, spread across the range of your world does help bring that scope
Mhm.
when reading it.
And I think that's something to really like sit with when you are starting out your book, is like how big you want your world to be, and like you said, the scope and the breadth of it. Because I think sometimes when we talk about world building, a lot of authors default to, my world has to be big, my world has to be huge, it has to have all of these things. And I think another key point of world building, especially to like doing it well, is to be comfortable with what you're writing. So if you're like, okay, I know that the character is going to be on this continent, like you don't have to make your world have like 8 continents if you don't want to build the world out that big. It can literally just be like, okay, we have this continent and this is how things are done. And if you're writing a series or something, one of the things that I feel like for world building is kind of, I don't want to say it's a cheat, but something to keep in mind is just like, if you just talk about one little place and you're writing a series, you can always build the world out later, as long as it ties into what you've already written. You don't have to start out knowing 100% of everything, you know? Um,
Yeah,
but
I agree. Sometimes keeping that 100% everything is hard in your head to keep it all.
look, look, it gets crazy. It gets crazy. Um, so we're gonna, if you guys are okay with it, there are several questions in the chat, and I know that we're having a Q&A at the end, but I want to make sure that we get to some of these. So quick question from the chat, and this one's from Melissa Adams, and she said, I have an isekai idea I'm developing, and there are elements that inspire my writing. How do I figure out world appropriate rules? And I think that's a really good question. It kind of leads into helpful writing tips. So any helpful writing tips specifically for, figuring out appropriate rules for the worlds?
Well, I know Isekai is one of Chelsea's favorite anime tropes to read. So why don't you take this one?
Okay. So fun fact, in case you are new here and never met me, hi, my name is Chelsea. I am an anime nerd. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. But for those of you who don't know, isekai is just the Japanese term for reincarnated in another world, died and ended up in another world, right? World building rules for that, I have never written isekai, but based off of what I have seen, when building out rules for that, I would say, one, understand how you get to this other world, and if your character is the only person who experiences that. But then also have limitations, I guess, on your character, because usually with the isekai trope, the idea is that your character has information that the rest of the world just doesn't have, whether it's they have more information about technology and growth from their previous life, or they just got sent back in time and so they know what's going to happen in the future. There's usually some benefit to being isekai'd into another world. So I would say the main rule is to know that, one, does it affect your character, only your character, and two, how does your character use whatever information, power, benefit that they have to their benefit, whether it be good, bad, ugly, whatever. And I think it's also important to figure out how the rest of the world is going to perceive them, because sometimes people are like, yeah, I'm from a different world, and sometimes they're like, I'm gonna keep this secret because people will absolutely have an issue with this. It's been done different ways, but I think it's more so what you feel comfortable with and how far you want to take it, because it can and I think this is an overall world building thing, not just an isekai thing, but understanding and kind of accepting like how far you want to take it. And I know that I said that, but I feel like it's worth repeating. But like how far you want to take your character in the world and how the world is going to react to the things your character is doing. Like consequences need to be a real thing in your world building. And again, that's just something that ties into plot as well. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think it touches on kind of like just a quickly, just like a bigger question of how to world build in regards to any genre.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely know the tropes of the genre that you're writing for. Because a lot of the times, whether that's high fantasy, lit RPG, like what are those tropes that would affect your world building? Because you want to touch on those things and get those things down to meet your audience expectations.
Yeah, because I know that both of us write fantasy, right? But the thing is, world building happens in every genre. Like even if you're writing a small town romance, you still need to know like how the world of your character works. So whatever level you're taking it to, just I don't know, getting into it. And I'm not gonna repeat it. I'm not gonna repeat it. I'm not going to repeat it. Otherwise, I'm going to be repetitive. It's my nervous tick. So, um, okay. So we talked about our process and most helpful world building tip that you've received. Like number one, top of all.
So, there's, a lot of the times when you start learning world building, you hear this very common adage of the iceberg problem, where it's, 10% should be visible above the surface while the rest is hidden underneath. And what I think is very interesting is that's actually taken from of anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
So from Edward Hall, I believe, 1976, where he talks about the cultural iceberg. When you are going and meeting other cultures and traveling places where, there's those characteristics that you see at the top,
Mm-hmm.
like food, language, entertainment, that's all on the top. But then there's also everything that's underneath, which is those kind of intangible concepts like attitudes and traditions. So I do like to think of world building from the iceberg, but from the more anthropological perspective of it. And so to kind of as an example, as because this is coming of age, name in my story of Forging of Age is really important, the namings of things and how names are treated in society. So I show you different types of things. For example, how individuals with no names are treated in society, the rituals and traditions that surrounds getting a name. So I show you all these different things to kind of support the fact that names and namings is important. Mm-hmm. So just because you don't see the bottom of the iceberg or just because you don't include it into your story, I do think that the effects of it should still be felt in the narrative. Like you still feel that it's there.
I agree. Because, like, obviously I've read your book. So as you're saying things, I'm like, yeah, I absolutely understand what you're saying. And I see how you implemented that. And it's kind of crazy because I'm like the exact opposite of that. My most helpful tip is just like, make it up when you need it and then go from there. So if Tatiana's advice is to like know the iceberg, mine is just like, avoid the part at the top. That's the part you need to be worried about. Mostly because I'm the type of person where I get really overwhelmed when I think about the iceberg. And so I'm very much like, okay, I will create this aspect once it becomes a thing that I know needs to happen. So, for example, We Are the Origin, right? There are 5 different districts or domains for the gods, right? And one of the things in the book is that they don't interact with each other because there are these barriers surrounding them, keeping the shaders out, which are man-eating monsters, right? That wasn't always that way. I just really needed a reason for the main character to be in like some backwaters place and not have the technology of the other places. And so I was just like, oh, this is why. And then I just kind of made it up. So my tip for world building is like making things up as your friend. Just make it up as you go along, and then in future drafts, that's when you can kind of figure out like why. Because first draft was just like, I don't know, they just don't talk to each other. I'll figure that out later.
I love that like the world building that we do, that trying to figure out a plot problem, right? Like, oh wait, this needs to happen. They need to go there. How can I make this?
Like literally, how do we get here?
Yeah. But yeah, like because on my first drafts, I feel like my world building is very flexible, and it's not until probably much later in the process that I finally decide. I'm like, okay, I guess this is the way it is. So yeah, very very similar. I'm like, we need monsters here.
We need monsters. We need a problem. And I feel like that's also a world building tip that you can really take. Is just like, oh, my brain stopped in the middle of that sentence, and I hated it because it was great. Hold on. It's like, wait. Oh, forget it. I hope you were listening. Just listen to the replay. Whatever Tatiana just said, just live with that. Oh, I hate it. It's gone. It'll come back and I'll shout it out randomly, and you could be like, there it is, Chelsea. There it is. But yeah, have fun with it. Make stuff up as you go along. And it's just like, I feel like you don't have to know. There we go. You don't have to know everything at the beginning, because something else that I feel like with world building, at least advice that I have seen, which kind of leads into our next point, advice that you reject, like absolutely vehemently reject. For me, it is the idea that you have to know everything before you ever put pen to paper. And I feel like authors can fall into that trap because there's so many like sheets, right? There are character sheets, there are plot sheets, there are world building sheets. There's a sheet for everything. And there are multiple versions of all of these sheets that ask you different questions and so much free advice. Like, oh my God, you're going to want to hear this advice on the internet. Where it's just like, you need to know this. And I saw one in particular that lives rent free in my brain. And it's just like, if you're building a medieval fantasy world, where does the poop go? And in my mind, I was just like, I don't know. But here's the thing, right? The reason I say you don't have to know everything is because as a 100% real person living in real life, I cannot tell you where the poop goes. I flush the toilet and I don't think about it anymore. So I could not answer that question in real life, and I'm living it. So I feel like it's okay to give yourself grace in those moments where you're also like in your fantasy world, I don't know where the poop goes. It's just not there anymore.
I'm the complete opposite. I'm like, I need to know all these things. Because for me, it's more fun when you throw in the mix. So it's like, wait, so how can we have like magical help us get rid of get rid of our everyday problems? That's always fun.
And I'm very much like, okay, this is a slight aside, but I'm very much like, in Assassin's Creed, there's that skill that you can unlock where the bodies just disappear. You no longer have to get rid of them. That's how my fantasy building works. I don't know. It just disappears. We don't think about it. It's a skill that was unlocked at some point.
Coins just show up in your pocket.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in bringing that up, because we were making fun of Assassin's Creed, but also like in your world building, if you set rules and you're consistent with those rules, even if the coins magically appear in your pocket, if that's a rule that you've established and you're consistent with it, then
roll with it.
That's roll fine. With it.
Like,
yeah, it's okay.
Elena has in here magic, but literally that. Like, if the rule of the world is just magic, I don't know, the poop goes with the magic. Cool. Just roll with that. Be consistent with that. It's fine. And I think that's another really huge world building tip as well. Whatever you come up with, be consistent. So, and I feel like this goes with like anything in your story, whether, because one of the big things, especially in fantasy, I think world building kind of defaults to talking about magic or whatever. And it's just like, always be consistent. Like your magic needs to have rules. And I would challenge you to think like your entire world needs to fall into that same thing. It needs to be consistent and it needs to have rules. And if there's something different, there needs to be a reason why this area of your world functions differently. And it could be culture. It could be like giant water divide or mountain divide or whatever. Or they live on a separate planet that floats above it. Whatever your reason is, it just needs to be consistent, and it needs to have rules for why it works that way. So if you're gonna be like, oh, these people don't talk to each other, but they live like next door to each other, is there a family feud? Are they like Timmy Turner's dad and Dinkelberg? Do they just hate each other? Like, what is it? And then also be consistent. They should not be best friends in the next chapter without significant reason.
One of my favorite examples of exactly what you're talking about is actually from George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones, where it's like they have a very long summer period and they have a very long winter period. Why does that actually make sense with planets and things? I can't tell you. I don't know. But it is a very fun plot device, right? Like the end of summer is coming and here's winter with the zombies. Like it adds such great tension to zombies? The story that you wouldn't have without it. Huh?
Did you just say zombies?
Ice zombies. I know you haven't seen it.
Sorry, my brain was just like, what? I didn't know that was a thing.
But yes, the reason why, it's so different is it adds tension to the story that you wouldn't have without it, which makes it more fun to read.
I agree. I'm going to take Tatiana's word for it because if you guys know me, I have not read George R. R. Martin at all. But also a slight world building tip. Read other people's books, and if you enjoy it, think about what about it made you feel that way. And I'm not saying that it has to be the classics, right? Because if you know anything about me, I am not a proponent for reading the classics. I'm a proponent for reading what you like. If you don't enjoy it, put it down. Life is way too short to be reading books that you don't like. But also, again, if you do read something and you're like, oh, this was really good, or I enjoyed how this person did X, Y, and Z, pay attention to it and be like, oh, this is why. So again, I'm a fan of Tatiana's work. And Forging of Age, the thing that I loved was the fact that the whole naming ceremony, because it's very satisfying. I'm not going to give it away. I just need you guys to read it and understand why it's so satisfying and why I was out here like, yes, at the end of the book. Anyway, moving on. The point is, if you enjoy it, understand why and incorporate that. But I would also challenge you to the things that you don't like, pay attention to that as well and be like, you know what? This ain't work for me. This was not it. I didn't enjoy this. Not highly coming for me because I have not read George R.R. Martin. I haven't. I'm so sorry. Forgive me, you guys. I am that girl who has no shame for admitting that I have not read the classics that I probably should have read to be a fantasy author. Just being real. Just being
That's
real.
why we're a team.
Yes. When I need to know things, I ask Tatiana, and then I'm also the person that's like, I don't know, let's just make it up. But on the plus side, I have watched a lot of anime. Like, I should probably have to speak Japanese fluently by now by how much anime I watch, but that's okay.
I was like, Izakai? Chelsea.
Pass the baton to me. I got this. Pick me. Okay. Taking another quick question from the chat before we move on to the next one. And this one comes from Six Cats Press, which is, what strategies do you suggest for people with Fantasia who are trying to world build? Can you tell me what that word means? What is Fantasia? Do you know what that means, Tatiana? You're smarter than me.
I might get it wrong, so please correct me. From what I understand, is Fantasia is where visual. So people who read, who can see everything they're reading, compared to people who read and they don't have a visual image behind it.
So Fantasia is not having the visual image?
I think so. Please help me, chat.
Okay, Six Cats Press said right. Okay.
Okay, I actually kind of have this. I actually, when I read, things aren't very vivid. I don't have a clear mental picture of it. Mm-hmm. So because of that, when I first started writing, it was very detailed. And this is a skill that I had to learn and I had to practice at. And so because of that, there is a draft specifically that I go in and say, okay, just the environment, just get the environment down, because when I'm drafting, I don't have that mental image. So I have a specific draft to focus on what's going on around everybody.
I'm going to leave that to Tatiana's, because I don't think I have anything to add to that, because I have the issue of I see everything and therefore I leave out really critical details because I'm like, I don't know, they're in the woods. What do you want me to tell you? And so I'm like, I should probably add more detail than that. So yeah, but I like that idea of, like you said, you mentioned at the beginning of like it's a layer cake and you go in and you add different things. But I think just also hearing that, even if you don't have Fantasia, I hope I'm saying that correctly, but just being like, okay, I have a draft for the environment and then have a draft for what people look like, and you focus on different things at different times. I feel like that would make world building as a whole like a lot easier, just in general.
Yeah. Yeah, it also helps kind of, now that I'm more experienced writer, knowing my weaknesses and knowing, okay, what I need to, like support a little bit.
Fair. So I guess that also kind of leads into our next question of, when does world building become overwhelming?
Did we do the reject one?
Did we? I know that I did. I know I gave mine. Did you give yours? We could probably just kept talking. What advice do you reject, love?
In regards to world building, I feel as if a lot of writers feel they need to make their world perfect and need everything to make sense. And as you kind of mentioned with the poop comment, there's a lot of things that in our world we don't know. And that will be the same for your characters as well. There's a lot of if you're not a historian or if you're not a scholar, like the everyday person isn't going to know these things. And even the things that we do know, sometimes don't make sense. Like sometimes historical events have happened and there's no rhyme or reason for them.
Yeah.
So when things aren't perfect, it's okay because it actually makes it feel more human and
Hmm.
makes it feel more realistic when everything doesn't align like just right and there's not pretty bows on everything, you know?
Absolutely, because one of the pieces of advice that I think about a lot, which shocker, comes from an anime. Is there's this one called Dror Stone, and basically the whole premise of it is that there's this beam from space that turns everybody to stone, and they're basically sent back to the Stone Age or whatever. And there's no internet, there's nothing. It's very primitive, and there's one character who's the main character. He is incredibly smart and he knows how to do all these things. Like he knows how to build cell phones and he knows how to build technology and he knows how things compound to build multiple things, right? Like to the point where he's like, oh, you have vision problems, I can create you glasses. And it was just one of those things where it's like when you are world building for yourself, the average person does not know how to break down a cell phone and rebuild it. We all have cell phones, we know how to use cell phones, but you don't have to. If every person isn't like, oh, okay, you have this, I don't know, I don't even know, I can't even make stuff up because I don't know what goes into a cell phone, right? But you got this piece of plastic, right? And then you do things with it. I think it's okay if there are gaps in, especially with your characters not being able to be like, hey, this was the significance of the Civil War that happened in this year and this time. I can't even tell you what year the Civil War happened in. I can tell you the results of it, but I can't tell you it's like, oh, from this year to that year, but it's also something significant in history. So something to keep in mind that I felt like fit with what you were saying.
And if that's what you want to do, like sometimes, as we were talking about using characters for world building, sometimes having a character who's an expert,
Mm-hmm.
for example, a medical expert or historian who can say those things helps. But yeah, just consider the point of view of your characters. They might not know everything. Again, this is assuming that you might be writing third person limited, but you might be writing third person omnipresent or, first person. So it also depends on point of view.
Also depends on point of view. And I will also add to that when it comes to world building, including characters, keep in mind that it's perfectly normal for certain characters to have a specialist, be a specialist. And if you're a doctor who knows everything about the body and physical things, they may know absolutely nothing about cooking and which mushrooms are safe to eat. Like that just may not be their specialty. And they'll be like, I'm really smart and I have a lot of information about this very specific thing. But this other thing, I'm just a normal person. I think that also adds dimension to your world too. But my brain stopped. Sorry. I think that does bring us to at what point does world building become overwhelming?
At least for me, I feel like world building becomes overwhelming when it is stopped writing. Now, everyone has a different writing process. Everyone has a different, like, you know, level of their writing processes. So, like, some people can spend like hours world building and, still get writing done for the day. Sometimes I spend hours world building and I'm so tired afterwards I don't get I don't get any writing down, or like sometimes you get bogged down into the details. And again, there's some people who been world building for years but hasn't started writing the story.
Mm-hmm.
So my advice is just never let world building stop you from writing.
Mm-hmm.
Write, as we've said before, you can always come back and world build later. You can layer it in, but get the writing, like get the words on the page.
Agreed. At the end of the day, as authors, you still have to do the thing, which is actually write. I would say for me, it becomes overwhelming when you start researching things that will never appear on the page. So I think it's one thing to research things that you want to make sure that you get right. A really good example of this that I get wrong all the time is like action scenes. I have to ask Tatiana for that because it's just like physics. How does this actually work? Even if there's magic involved, there are certain things that need to make sense, right? So it's like, sure, I don't mind spending like going down a slight rabbit hole for that, right? Or how we would get to like how this character would actually have to live to have like a six pack, whatever. Tatiana probably knows. But it's also like if I get to the point where I'm like, oh, let me research what type of shoes the queen would wear. Like, why would that matter? Wait, what?
Oh, I just whispered, I do know, but keep going.
See, this is what I mean. This is what I be meaning. But no, I think world building gets overwhelming when you start researching things that are never going to show up on page that you don't have to get right in order to keep the story going. There are some things where it's just like, if you pick up that information while you're doing your research, like if it's important to know what kind of gown the queen would wear in your world, cool. Even if the shoes come up in that research, that's fine. But if you're researching that because you're just like, oh, I just want to know, this is going in the iceberg, this is going below the water, your world building is probably starting to get a little bit out of hand and need to rein it in just a little bit. Just a little bit. Keep the main thing the main thing, as we say in this household.
And sometimes what I find overwhelming, because, I want those details and, like sometimes I'm very obsessive about it. But when you go into world building, especially for not medieval Europe, when you go into like Africa or Asia or, Latin America, sometimes there's not a lot of sources, scholarly sources in English, or you need to have it translated. So doing that extra work can sometimes feel overwhelming when you're like, I want to get this right.
No, that's real, and I think it's something else to like consider, especially if you are writing, like you said, a non Eurocentric fantasy world, or if you're like me and trying to like create something completely unbiased than anything else. It's just like, this sounds fun, we're just gonna make everything up. Also would not recommend, that's actually a lot of work, just throwing that out there. But I think it's important to kind of hone in, and I would say like understand where your limitations are, especially if you are doing research from other cultures. It's just like, know when you start tiptoeing into areas that are like, I don't know about this, and I guess reining in your world building. And I think it's okay to be like, I don't know enough about this to include it in a meaningful way in my story, so we're going to leave it out. Especially when it comes to things like orishas and like religious practices that are actually practiced. Like it's mythology, but it's also a religious practice that people use in real life in current day. I think it's okay to like hit your boundary and be like, I'm gonna just draw that back in and we're just not gonna touch it, Yeah,
that's a great point.
Yeah, which is also why I make everything up, because the way my brain is not set up for research, it's not. It is not.
Well, sometimes I use like inspiration. So like, for example, a lot of people, my Forging A series is kind of set in a North African inspired setting, right? Kind of very Sahara Desert. And so I research about Egypt, and what a lot of writers would do is like, okay, they have a Nile River, I'll write a Nile River. Mm-hmm. But what I did was I looked at, okay, the Nile River informs, a lot of the religion, it forms a lot of the mythology, it forms a lot of the economy of Egypt. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to have an element like that informed the culture in the same way. Mm-hmm. So in Forging of Age is a giant dragon. And so using that as inspiration and not translating it one-to-one, I'm like, okay, this giant dragon, how that informs the culture, how that informs their religion, how that informs their belief system. So just understanding how things like how culture builds and how society builds on each other can be very helpful when you're building your worlds.
I actually have nothing to add to that, because Tatiana is way better at it than I am when it comes to like culture things. So 100% take that, write it down, mark this, come back to it, tell your friends. They should be watching all of the Authortube writing conference, actually. So slight plug. But that also ties into another question that we had, which comes from writer Sam Wicker, who asked, do you build a book Bible as you write and draft to keep up with the changes between drafts? And since we were talking about it, and I actually know the answer to this question, I figured it would be good to like add that in here.
Yeah, so world building can become very overwhelming, and a lot of writers do keep a world Bible. Mm-hmm. I did not, and for my first duology, but the book that I'm currently writing in is set in the same world but in a different area, And that was the point where I said, I can't hold all of this in my head anymore. I just can't. So I had to, after the fact, go in and create a world Bible after it was published. But I mean, after it's published, I can't change it. So it's like, okay, well, this is definitely what it is now.
This is what it is. I think for me, I the answer is yes and no. I do not have one for my first trilogy. It just lived in my head, and I think honestly that is something that a lot of when you're newer to writing, it's just like you have one story, and that one story lives in your head, and you know it in and out. Especially, I feel like this. And this is just a correlation that I personally have seen. I'm not saying that this is like a generalization, right? But from what I've personally seen, it happens a lot to beginning fantasy writers because we spend so much time in a world before we actually sit down to write the book. We know it inside and out, left, up, down, right. You could throw any character in any situation and immediately just instinctively know how that character would react for the most part. And it's not until you write the book or the second book and you start writing other things because you're building up your author space, and you're like, someone's like, ooh, can you write this little short for an anthology? Or you're like, oh, I'm just gonna work on another project really quick, and then you come back to it and you're like, oh my god, who was this character, what was she doing? Why was she doing this? So I would say that story bibles are great. I would also argue that writing them after the fact instead of trying to write it while you're writing could also be beneficial if you sorry you guys, it can be beneficial if you are the type of person where you fall down the rabbit hole and you know that you fall down the rabbit hole. That's just my 2 cents. Take it or leave it, spin it how you like. But I am trying to build one for We Are the Origin. I will get back to that at some point in the future when I get back to that. For my current projects, there are certain things that I am writing down, mostly as it pertains to the characters, but less about the world building, ironically. Mostly because for me, my characters, the way they navigate through the world is so based in the actual world building. A lot of the things, like, I have it written down, but it's more so smaller things, if that makes sense, that lead up to bigger things. I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but
Yeah,
hopefully
and
it
I will
does.
tell you a secret. After I finished that world, the world Bible,
Hmm.
world Bible.
Story Bible.
After the 2 books, yeah, story Bible. After the 2 books that I wrote, I there definitely was a character that I flipped names, and I was like, hmm, let me change that before anyone notices. So we can definitely help you find some consistency mistakes.
Absolutely. I will also say though, if you are a pantser, definitely do your story Bible after you write the book, but before you publish. That's the sweet spot. That way you can catch things before it's live, but also you are not. I feel story Bibles very much fall into that plotter area, because there are also a lot of advice about doing those ahead of time. I tried that. As a pantser, would not recommend it. My brain hates it. I don't know if you're like me, but if you are, would not recommend.
Yeah, my brain hates it too because I find that a lot of things change, and so it's like, oh, I'm doing this work twice, and I think that's why it's harder for me.
My brain does the thing where it's like, oh, I've already written this. Why am I writing it again? No, we got to change it now. Okay. A couple more questions, and we are coming up 15 minutes until we wrap this up. So if you guys have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A, and we will definitely try to answer them before we head out. But 2 more questions. First one being, what is something in your world building that you struggled with, and how did you fix it?
So, my duology that I wrote, I started it in high school,
Mm-hmm.
and it was kind of like a little bit further in time than what I eventually published it. So that means I was kind of been working on this book for 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
On and off. But now that I'm going back in this third book and going back to some of the areas that I wrote when I was in high school, it's like, that that world building that I'm now stuck with. How is this gonna work? So Sometimes when you've been world building for very long, or sometimes it's even that like that when you start writing, you've published your first book and you're starting writing your second book, and it's like, oh wait, something I've established in my world building isn't working.
Yeah.
What do I do?
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to just come up with very creative puzzles around it. And you might find some very fun solutions. And other times I have seen authors where they just put in their author's note and they're just like, look, I've changed this.
I've had to change this for reasons, otherwise it wasn't going to work. Hate that
Yeah.
for you guys, but also necessary.
So, if it happens, and it will happen if you're writing a long series, sometimes you find that, you're like,
It's like I did this
Yeah.
to myself, actually. But no,
Yeah.
I get that because I had a similar issue with We Are the Origin, because the character first came to me not when I was in high school, but in a different, completely, I'll say, life stage than when I actually wrote the book. And so for me, my problem was I kind of had to scrap the whole idea for the original world building and rebuild it again. So I guess my advice kind of aligns with yours in that if you are doing a series particularly, be mindful of your world building, because you will change your mind. And I think the hard thing is when you write, you get better at it the more you do it. And so the things you came up with, no matter what age you are or what life stage you're in, you're always going to look back and be like, wow, why did I do that? I mean, I have much better ideas now. And you're like, why did I come up with this then? What was I thinking? But I think the biggest thing that I kind of have learned, especially writing We Are the Origin and then We Are Dying Gods, is to leave space for wiggle room. Even if you think, oh no, it's going to be like this. I promise you, you're going to change your mind. You're going to change your mind. And just leaving space to incorporate new ideas without having to, like you said, put in an author's note and be like, by the way, you guys, I had to change this because it didn't make any sense. Just leave some space for it. But yeah. And then our last question before we get into the Q&A. So again, a reminder to drop your questions in the chat. And if you do have it, put a Q in front of it so we can see it, or put it in the actual Q&A question bar at the top of the chat. But 3 world building tips that you can give. And I feel like we've given a lot. So succinct, I guess.
Yes. 3 more. So another world building tip is specificity, because you can do a lot with specificity in a short real estate, in a short time frame. So for example, these characters set by the campfire and ate food. Well, if you say the characters ate by the campfire and ate the skinned rabbit, right? Like the cooked rabbit. Like it's just, it gives a little bit more flavor to the sentence, and it is not, it's not info dumping. It's not a lot of information. Just being very clear with like just words. It could be 2, 3, very concise and very specific.
Mm-hmm.
Just does a lot for your world building in a short amount of time. My next one is culture is not static, because I think the thing is, a lot of times we do spend all these time world building.
Mm-hmm.
And once, we put those rules in our heads, it's set in stone. But the thing is, realistically, for example, if you have a big plot event that happens in your book, you have these really, if it's, you're doing a book set over time, culture is not static, it's dynamic, it changes. Fashion might change, architecture might change, like the politics, how people do things might change because an event in your book. So always be considered how things change, just not how things change and not always how they are. And another thing is, don't be afraid to come back later. As I said, I have several drafts. It's okay to be like, oh yeah, this person's name. Keep on going. Oh yeah, that random town. I'll name it later. As I said, don't let it keep you from writing the book. You can always come back later and kind of add those things in. But yeah, and also don't be afraid to take breaks. Sometimes you do need that mental rest. Sometimes you need to refill your creative well and kind of just take in different things. So don't be afraid to take a rest.
Absolutely. I 100% second that because your brain will get tired. You will get tired of having to make things up at some point. So when you get to that point, take a rest because if you don't, your body will demand that you take a rest and it's going to be way longer than if you had just voluntarily done it ahead of time. So, um, that being said, my three world building tips is one, start from the top down. So understanding the big things that don't change in your world first, and then building down to the things that are flexible that you know you can adjust as you go along, makes things a little bit easier because, generally speaking, and this is a generalization, not putting words in anyone's mouth, right? But generally speaking, the gods of your world and like the history of your world isn't going to necessarily change. So understanding the main aspects of that and how it's going to influence your main character, especially if you have like an epic and it's just like, hey, you need to overthrow this corrupt regime. Understanding how what that regime is, whether it's a monarchy, whether it's a dictatorship, whether it's a parliament, whatever, understanding what it is and why the main character needs to overthrow it and how it got there, and that helps before you start building out, okay, so this person is actually sitting in this seat of power and they have this family and da, da, da. Like get get the top big things first and then work your way down, right? Which aligns with what Tatiana was saying. But then also make things up as you need to instead of trying to like I said, know everything up front. Being able to just be like, oh, okay, they need to get across this ocean and technology isn't really a thing here, so we need magic. The reason is magic. We are going to make this up. As long as there's a reason for the magic. Like, okay, if we have flight magic now, why isn't everyone flying? Like, just if you're going to make it up, just that's fine, but also make it consistent. But I think giving yourself freedom and fun when you're world building is really key because if you try to make too many things very detail specific, it gets that's the point where it gets overwhelming when you have to come up with a reason for your reason for your reason, if that makes sense. And third world building tip is honestly to have fun with it. I think at the end of the day, this is your world, this is your story. It should be a world that you yourself want to live in. Like readers, if you have fun with it, that will come across on the page. And if you want to live in your world, there will be other readers who will read it and be like, I also want to live in this world. So I think that's at the core of it, something that I think as writers, no matter what the advice is, no matter how much time you spend with your world building, it needs to be something that you yourself enjoy, right? Don't make a magic system that you hate, you know? Don't make a religion system that you're like, I wouldn't do this, but you know, these characters will. Like, and I think just have fun exploring topics that you maybe wouldn't have thought about in other ways, if that makes sense. I think world building is really great for exploring and challenging your own thought processes about things. So, especially if you're writing like high fantasy, like if you're writing small town romance or if you're writing a horror and it's based in the real world, obviously there are some things, gravity exists in the real world, so obviously you can't just get rid of that. But challenging certain ideas that you have. But yeah, that being said, you guys, we have about 5 minutes before I'm probably going to be yelled at for going over. So I think that's time for a couple of questions and then we will head out. I saw one in the chat, so give me a second while I try to find it. But y'all were chatting in this chat. Love that. I can't find the exact one, but I remember it coming across the screen, and it was basically like, does building your story Bible while help with revision? Does it help with revision? I believe it was something along the lines of that. Does that make sense to you?
It makes perfect sense to me. I'm even considering doing that after like my third draft just to double check the consistency. So I do like, as you said, like there is kind of a sweet spot as you had mentioned before, Chelsea, like a little bit after a couple of drafts where you have a good sense of what the world is and things might not change as much. But before you publish, I think it'd be a great tool to kind of just go back through and make sure, you're dotting all your I's and crossing your T's.
Yeah. And I agree. And also just seeing everything laid out, your story Bible does help you get like a bird's eye view. And I think it does help with revision for the simple fact that you catch things. Usually assuming that you take at least like a week or something off between finishing the book and doing the story Bible. A fresh set of eyes and laying everything out from a bird's eye perspective can really help, especially when you're like, oh, I need to reframe or restructure things. Um, so yeah, last question, and this one's from Randy Harris. Do you feel like figuring out the world building as you write helps helps stronger characters than trying to write characters that fit into the world you created beforehand? Does that make sense? So
Um,
figuring out your world building as you write helps create stronger characters than trying to shoehorn your characters into world building that you already created.
so I have the personal preference of doing the former,
Mm-hmm.
mostly because I am a character-driven writer, and my characters tell me a lot. And there's, sometimes they don't tell me things, which is kind of annoying. And I'm like, oh, that lady killed your mother? Like, why didn't I know this? Now I gotta go back in and write all that. Or even like just recently, like there was just one motion that they had done, and I was like, oh, that's how they're parting. Like that's how this culture part ways. And they had just told me. So sometimes, yeah, like your characters, they'll tell you,
Yeah.
and sometimes they won't. And for those specific instances, and it might just be the context of whatever your plot is. So it might be easier to kind of take a break, write a short story or something that you want to explore. Say that, oh, I don't really know what the politics looks like, or I don't really know what this looks like, and write your character within that situation, and see how they react, and it
Mm-hmm.
might help you figure out what that world building is.
I agree. I second that. I think if you build your world building around your character, that does help because then your character shapes the world and that makes them feel like they actually live in that world versus you being like, this is it, this is everything, and then trying to like basically airdrop somebody into this world and it's just like they don't affect it, and that can make your writing feel, your character feel like they're disconnected from the world that they live in, or that their culture or wherever they live hasn't actually affected them growing up. So having them shape each other, I think, makes for a better end product, I'll say, altogether.
Yeah, makes it feel
But
more dynamic.
But that being said, you guys, that is it for the fantasy world building. Thank you guys for being here, for being a part of the Authortube Writing Conference. Again, my name is Chelsea CM Lockhart. I was here with Tatiana OB. And if you haven't, there are links in the chat to fill out the feedback form. Make sure that you do that. There is a giveaway as well. And thank you guys so much for being here. There is a playlist as well, so you can see the other panels. Elaine dropped the link for the next presentation, which is Dale L. Roberts Self-Publishing Insiders panel. So get into that, and we will see you in the next one. And if you would like to purchase our books, We Are the Origin, We Are Dying Gods, Bones of the Wind, Sister Samurai, any of that, there are links down in the description box below. And if you have more questions, you can leave them in the comments, and we will get back to them. So that's it. Thank you guys for being here, and until next time, hope your days are lovely and your books are full of melanin. Bye, you guys.
Bye.